Hello, I'm Indrajit Ghule, and this is my colleague Kedar Sharma. Today we will be presenting our research, which was done as part of the master's course at Politecnico di Milan. Our research talks about defining urban voids for Indian cities, a case of Pune. Urban voids for Indian contexts are a very interesting phenomena where the growth of the city manifests these urban voids. The growth pattern in Indian cities can be seen into a repetitive pattern. There are different commonalities, simultaneities, and the cities also have a plural identity. Due to this, a urban void is generated in Indian context. So the research tries to understand what is the notion of the urban void in India. So we try to understand a formal and an informal definition of urban voids for Indian cities. The research also tries to understand how these voids are created and why do they exist. What are the reasons? Because if it is because of rapid expansion, are there any roles of local and global actors? Are there influences of non-architectural actors, geopolitics and economic factors? And how the urban morphology's evolution within the city and beyond its limits has created these urban voids. The research focuses to understand urban voids through the lens of the city of Pune, and we try to understand how the value of these voids hold for Pune. Pune city is located around 150 kilometers from Mumbai with a population of 10 million people. To understand the phenomena of voids for Indian context, we first do a literature study where we try to understand definition of voids for different contexts, the interpretation of voids for global north and global south, from which we arrive at our interpretation or a first preliminary understanding of what void means to us through the literature study. So we understand void can be an emptiness. It is a break into the continuity of urban fabric. Maybe the void which remains today is not a void for tomorrow. And voids are impacted with several actors that influence its existence. The methodology of research can be broken into four different parts. The first being the literature review, where we understand the various definition of voids and the theories of urban voids, from which we try to understand our interpretation of void, focusing on the definitions in an Indian context, and then moving on to the city of Pune, where we try to understand the city, the identities for the city, the urban history of the city, and how the city has grown over time, the urban expansion which it faces, and focusing the research into the eastern suburbs of the city, where we try to understand the different growth patterns in the city and how these patterns have arrived to these different voids, what are the role of local and global actors in the city, and from all these we try to arrive at a taxonomy of voids. So, through the taxonomy, we try to then come to a definition of urban void, which is an addition to an existing glossary of definitions of urban void. Indian cities can be said to have multiple identities. Everything exists at same time. We do not really understand which century we are in. So the historic part also relates to the contemporary part of the cities, and everything exists in simultaneity. With such complex cities, we chose Pune, which also has various different identities, starting from its historic identity during the Peshwa period. The city witnessed a lot of transformation in its architectural and urban planning character during the colonial period. Then, post-independence, the city started to be known as the Oxford of the East, where a lot of educational institutes started getting established in the city. With all these transformations and adaptation of the city also holds the character to be called as the cultural city. And with current times in the 21st century, with globalization, the city is also called as the IT hub or the IT city. With these multiple identities in the city, we can see how the city has grown along the banks of the river Mula and Mutha. From the historical center to the addition of cantonments to the municipal limits growing. So we try to understand these different changes with identity and with respect to different thresholds of planning acts, changes in architectural style, along with the demand for population and the growing population of the city. And we can understand that the city is now currently in a crisis with respect to the demand of population and the urban sprawl and the lack of infrastructure, which the city is trying to cope up with the demand. The research tries to understand all these phenomena with different kinds of thresholds in the city with respect to various planning acts, with respect to change in architectural styles, how it has impacted the city over the years. To understand this phenomena of urban voids, the research then ventures into mapping of various actors and influences in the city. So we try to understand over a course of time which are the various actors and influences which impact the city. Here, the research focuses on various studies of understanding the urban history of Pune, then understanding the architectural history of Pune and the planning history of Pune as well. We understand various influences such as planning acts, which has created the influence, what are the morphological changes, and also what are the cultural influences in the city, and how the international experts have created an impact in the city. So, this exercise of mapping the actors and influences helped us to understand the impact of them on the different growth patterns in the city and also on the urban morphology of the city. After that, what the research we did was we localized all these different influences and actors and the architectural objects in the city and understood how the objects have created an impact on the city from the city center to the overall suburban regions and how along the city while it is growing radially.
As my colleague mentioned, the city of Pune, like many other Indian urban regions, has multiple layers, and it has been affected by different pluralities of the history. And one such plurality was to study such pluralities. We decided to focus on the eastern suburbs of Pune, the eastern side of Pune, and the way if you you see the morphology, the history of the city, the way Pune has grown from the historical center to the colonial addition to the industrial developments and now to the villages, we go through each phase of its growth. And coming to this platform as well, the city, even though Pune is relatively less known or relatively less documented, there have been a lot of global actors and stakeholders, and along with the local influences. And this has kind of created the growth patterns which have, changed the existing land use and the morphology. So the prevalent identity and the ideology that the city possesses is very it's multifaceted. And to understand the idea of growth patterns, we focus on one section, and this helps us arrive to something called a taxonomy of voids. Now, the taxonomy is something that we have made to understand the concept of urban words. Since urban words can be classified into many different categories, it was important for us to create a structure in which will allow us to classify them into ideas that we understand. So the research kind of starts venturing into how do we classify these urban words. Then we understood that these urban words have been created due to different growth patterns. And the growth patterns have been there for, let's say, decades, centuries. And that's why the taxonomy of growth patterns helps us create a taxonomy of voids. Each growth pattern has certain voids, and these growth patterns have become responsible for shaping these voids and also its future. So, dwelling deeper into such growth patterns and the taxonomy, we come to the first growth pattern in the eastern suburbs of Pune, which is called fragmentations. So, the voids due to fragmentation have been created by this concept of division of land with each coming generation. So the area of the land holding keeps on getting smaller, and multiple stakeholders keep on getting added. And that's why there is a discontinuity in the growth of the city and these suburban and urban regions. And that's why the voids that have been created are either in the form of bound spaces, when in which an empty land plot has been just lying around, and the urban expansion, the urban morphology has continued to grow around it, or they have become sinks, like a time capsule, where the land has become a stagnant element in an otherwise ever changing urban morphology. And coming to the next growth pattern, now if we focus on the expansion and growth, we come to the voids that have been created due to planned developments. Now, as we speak on, let's say, a global platform, similarly, Pune has had a lot of global influences, and these influences have kind of stimulated the growth of planned developments. But these planned developments are responsible for creation of certain zones of conflict amongst between themselves. So what happens is these planned developments have a very strong physical as well as an ideological influence on its surroundings. And due to that, the socio-economic setting of the place changes. It can be these planned developments can be form of residential townships, it can be large scale developments, it can be something that has been triggered by local planning law, or also industrial growth. So the voids that have been created due to these planned developments are empty spaces, which are in the form or like wanting spaces. So these empty land plots want to be something that is similar to the planned development that is adjacent to them. So, but it does not have the, let's say, economic resources, or there are some bureaucratic shortcomings, and that's why these empty land plots, become voids, and and we term it as wanting spaces. And then certain voids, such as these, kind of transform into meanwhile landscapes or green reserves. And these voids kind of act like the green lungs of the city. Pune is a very, it is an ecologically rich area. And these green lungs kind of add to the value of the city, but then they are not permanent or they're not protected. They are just a result of whatever has been happening, or due to. And then another phenomena that is very frequent is also that due to certain planning regulations and policies, the owners or the stakeholders have some namesake built up, a very small built up area on the land plots, and otherwise the land is empty, and this kind of helps them protect the land from future changes in the laws. And that's why these meanwhile namesake built ups also kind of add to the emptiness or the voids that have been created due to land developments. Coming to the next growth pattern and the voids created due to this growth pattern is the juxtaposition of elements. Now, as me and my colleagues spoke about how different elements coexist together, and there's a lot of pluralism happening, there's a lot of simultaneity happening. There are different ideologies that kind of impact the eastern suburban zones of Pune, not just physically, but metaphorically, ideologically. And these elements are strong, but when they are placed next to each other, they can become like a contrast. So you'll see the morphology has a lot of these contrasts. And when we researched on these contracts, we were trying to map them, we were trying to understand them. We kind of came across this concept of urban islands. Now we know what urban islands are, and it's a very well spoken theory, a very well known theory in Europe as well. But our focus was on the space between these urban islands. These they are metaphorical in nature. These spaces, there are some morphological differences, and because of the scale, the expanse of these voids, they also cause discontinuity. So the growth is there in islands, but what happens to the space in between? These are the voids that are created due to juxtaposition of elements, and they again keep on changing with time. And now coming from these planned developments to the juxtaposition, when we go on a, let's say, a more smaller scale, we come across this concept of very popular concept of gated communities in India, where there are a lot of private, residential, commercial, mixed-use gated communities. And what happens because of this is, since they are private developments, it's a more introverted form of growth. And the idea, of course, is to to give an elevated standard of lifestyle to provide security, to provide different amenities. But since it's private, it's fragmented, it's very autonomous, and it does not necessarily contribute to the continuity of the urban fabric of the city. And this has happened in Pune, and that's why you'll see there are some social physical divisions that have been observed in these suburban regions, and this can be also said for most of the growing cities in India. And Pune is no different. But the kind of voids they create, they're very interesting, because either they're policy based, because certain land parcels or empty land plots do not fit into this concept of gated community, they're not desirable, or they're corner plots or something, so it does not really work out. Or there are broken spaces where the gated communities have just propped up in different parts of the city, and then a certain part of the land gets left behind. Or they become something we call as Maidan. It's a popular word which is, I think, used in most of the Asian languages as well. And what it means is an open ground. It's a multi-purpose open area. And these multi-purpose areas are used for hosting different events, during different festivals, during political rallies, or so what I'm trying to say is they hold uh, a value, let's say an intangible value. So certain voids hold such a value which cannot be measured in terms of our conventional urban design theories or studies. They have a socio-economic and cultural element attached to it. They are responsible for a lot of interaction that happens within the community, and they are, let's say, desired within a dense neighborhood. For example, children play in the evening, they host different festivals. So we came across this thought, and when we held some interviews, qualitative through a qualitative research and interviews, we understood that a lot of these empty areas hold an intangible value, and they hold a lot of potential for the future of the city. And coming, how do we understand this potential as well? So the taxonomy kind of led us to this creation of atlas of voids, putting together all these different voids together, the growth patterns, the voids that are created because of these growth patterns. We understand that voids are just not an empty space devoid of built up. We understood that they hold certain intangible values. We understood that they are evolving constantly. And through our mapping and photographic documentation and interviews, we understood that the definition is very contextual in nature. So, to coming towards the conclusion of the research, as I said, we understood these things. Uh, we want to lay some emphasis on the fact that this is a methodology. It is a taxonomy. It's not the taxonomy. So this methodology is one of our methodologies that we used, but I think there can be, we think that there can be multiple ways to arrive at a certain point in which you can study urban voids through different growth patterns. And hence, to understand the Indian cities and how they grow and the urban words within it, context is extremely important. One void can be classified into another category, or one void can be interlinked to another void. So it's kind of depends on who is studying and what is the context that they're studying. So the voids, which are extremely contextual in nature, are responsible for shaping the morphology, and they hold a certain value, which intangible value. And then we started with a definition of voids that we found through different studies and different literature reviews. And then we arrived at another definition with which I would like to conclude, that a physical space, definition of void, a physical space or metaphorical perception of an emptiness that affects the continuity of the existing urban morphology, but not necessarily be a cause of discontinuity within an urban fabric. So what we're trying to say that some voids might be physically empty or unbuilt, but they bind the city together through the way they interact with its context. So the context here becomes extremely important part of the definition of the void. So this interaction is intangible in nature, and it keeps on evolving due to the presence of different actors and influences. Voids are a result, a product of pluralities and simultaneities that are acting on an urban morphology. And since these urban morphologies have different identities, the multidisciplinary actors and influences are also responsible for their creation for the future. We also have to understand that they are not just negative elements. We should go beyond their perception of negative elements, and They are temporary in nature, they're temporal in nature, they keep on evolving, and they add vibrance to the context. And they hold a lot of potential, which we still need to realize in different Indian cities. Thank you.